I'm wondering if you recently have had this happen to you, similar to this. Thursday night, I was driving home from an appointment and remembered that I was running low on some supplies at home for kitchen and bath. So unfamiliar neighborhood, unfamiliar store, walked in, wasn't sure where to find things, and noticed that there was a woman who, she was slightly turned and she was putting something on the shelf, and she was all dressed in blue, top and bottom, blue. I thought, well, probably sales staff, so she'll know where my product is. And I said, excuse me, I'm wondering, does this store carry kitchen and bath supplies? And she kind of turns and she says, oh yeah, we do. I said, oh, great. And where would they be? And she goes, well, I'm kind of over there. Oh, okay. And then I gave her my list. I said, I'm looking for this, and this. Does this store carry those things? She looks at me and she goes, probably. And then she busts out laughing and she says, I don't work here. I said, oh, I'm so sorry. At that point, she turned around so I could see her fully. The reason she was dressed all in blue, it wasn't a uniform for this store. It was hospital scrubs. Do you know what she had on her upper left, near her shoulder, and embroidered? Her name. Do you know what was before her name? DR. Do you know what was after her name? MD. The second line was her specialty, and then the third line was the hospital that she works in. And I looked at her and I said, you're a doctor. And she said, I am. And I said, I'm embarrassed. In fact, I am really embarrassed. And so she starts laughing and she goes, oh no, it's really okay. I said, no, it's not okay. I am so sorry. And then I said to her, I said, you know, you're probably listening to me read my list and you're saying to yourself, I went to medical school for guys like this. And she goes, no, it's really okay. It could happen to any of us. And I looked at her and I said, oh, thank you. That is such a relief. And she, we smiled and we walked on. And so in life, you probably are guessing where this is all going. In life, we have those embarrassing moments where we just need relief from our embarrassment, right? And that's life. And I'm sure you've had moments like that, maybe even recently. But as we were saying last week, life has all that level of human experience. And then life has this deeper level that goes way beyond embarrassment. And the emotion that you have from being embarrassed periodically turns into an emotion that is so deep and so painful that you can't even put it into words. And that's what we were talking about last week and that we're going to continue on this week. If you have your Bibles, we're in John's Gospel, chapter 11, because we were opening up this chapter last week in the first 16 verses, and we were talking about this amazing account of Jesus Christ and this family in the village of Bethany near Jerusalem, and this man Lazarus that had died, and his two sisters, Martha and Mary, and all the people that were gathered around grieving over the death of Lazarus. And so this was an emotion that went far beyond embarrassment, right? And so last week we were talking about this apparent indifference that Christ has, waiting 2 days to go to Bethany. And then we talked about this unexpected explanation, how he explains why he waited for the glory and the greater purposes of God. And then we saw Thomas, this very unlikely response from the Apostle Thomas that we really wouldn't have, it was expected, but it really wasn't, given Thomas's personality. So today we're going to look at this deeper emotion of life, grief. We just kind of introduced this last week, and we're going to hopefully go a little deeper with this. And so we're calling this morning relief for those in grief. And grief may not be current with you. Some of you have said goodbye to people you love this year, and so your grief, I know, is current. For some of us, maybe it's been a few years, but as we said last week, it's inevitable, right? If you made a list of everyone you love, eventually they will no longer be alive, right? And you will say goodbye to people that you love eventually. And on the other hand, your life may come to an end before those, so those you love may say goodbye to you, and that's an adjustment. It's just inevitable. It's part of life, right? So the first thing we want to look at today, relief for those in grief. First of all, Christ and our mind. I want to just read the verse beginning with verse 17, because Jesus has now come to Bethany. He's traveled 90 miles to this village where this family and friends are gathered. And then it says in verse 17, now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him. But Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. Christ in our mind. Go back to verse 17. He comes, Lazarus had been in the tomb 4 days. Why is that significant? Well, it goes back to what we talked about last week, and it partly explains why Jesus delayed 2 days, because he waited 2 days. It took another 2 days for him to travel 90 miles. And the primary purpose of this, and we're going to see this before we're done this morning in greater picture of this, but for Jewish people in the first century, there was this teaching and this belief that when a person died physically, their death, their soul remained for 3 days near their body before it departed. Now, some of you are aware of this, and this is still true for Jewish people, observant Jews. Jewish people don't embalm. Embalming is a practice that's done various parts of the world, but Jewish people don't embalm. That's one of the reasons that an observant Jew, even today, it's not quite like it used to be, but you're supposed to be buried the same day that you die. And part of that is just because of, without embalming, the body decay, the decomposition of the body. And so the Jews believe that after 3 days, the body, lack of embalming, it's a hot climate in the Middle East, so decomposition of the physical body and the soul couldn't be part of that, so then the soul departed. That's one of the reasons Jesus waited for 2 days. Why did he want to do that? Because and we're going to see this in our point 3 about understanding the culture in which he ministered in that culture, he knew that people still believed that maybe death hadn't occurred, because if the soul was still hovering for 3 days over the corpse, maybe the person has just what we now call swoon theory. It was applied also to Jesus, after his crucifixion, that maybe the person actually hadn't died. But given what Jesus intends to do, to raise Lazarus from the dead, and understanding the culture in which he does it, he makes sure that he does not show up till the fourth day. Because on the fourth day, every Jew said, oh, well, they're dead. And so this just adds even stronger evidence when he does raise Lazarus, that everyone that saw it and heard it and witnessed it said, wow. See, so you see where this is going. Part of our mind is involved here. But more importantly, it has to do with Martha, the sister that we call Martha. And we only have one other account of Martha and Mary. It's not a lot to go on. But if you just take the evidence from this passage, and in Luke chapter 10, you probably know that story where they're having a dinner party and Martha's upset. She's in the kitchen doing all the work. Mary's out in the living room, sitting at Jesus' feet, listening to him teach. Martha comes out and says, tell my sister to get in the kitchen and help me. So she's kind of task-oriented. If that's all we have to go on, that's your conclusion. But there's more to Martha than just that. Just like we saw last week, there was more to Thomas than just being a doubting person. Martha has another capacity, but it involves her mind. And as we just read, so he arrives. Martha, don't miss this. Martha and Mary are surrounded by people who had come. They're only 2 miles from Jerusalem, city center, and many people had come out. Now, here's another thing that's just important to understand. This is true for Jews today, too. Have you heard this concept, Shiva? In Hebrew language, Shiva means 7, just the number 7. And so for observant Jews today, when someone dies, you're supposed to observe Shiva. That's 7 days of mourning, right? When a loved one dies in your family. And even today, Shiva means that if you have a friend who they have a loved one that dies, then you take food to their home, and it's called sitting Shiva. So you go to the home and you sit and you talk. It's not that you don't talk, but the friends basically bring the food, comfort the family, and they do most of the talking. But you have to say something. You can't just talk about trivial things. There's a certain protocol in what you talk about. Well, that goes all the way back to the first century. That's what's going on here. Here's the other aspect of this. The Bible at another part says, not in the Bible, I'm sorry, it's actually in rabbinical writings. The rabbis said that even if you're poor, if someone dies in your family, you have to find enough money that even for you to do Shiva properly, a sitting Shiva, you have to be able to hire 2 people that play a flute. So there's musical presence involved. And then you have to be able to hire at least one person who is what we would call a professional mourner. These are people, that was actually their job. They got paid to go and mourn on behalf of a family. Well, what's different here? What's different here is many had come. A crowd had come from Jerusalem. So the fact that this Shiva that's going on in the home of Lazarus and Mary involves a lot of people. Tells you one of the things it tells you is Mary, Martha, and Lazarus had access to money. They were fairly well off, or they couldn't afford this, because these are professional mourners that had traveled 2 miles from Jerusalem. You also see an indication that Mary, there's another account you'll see in chapter 12. Remember, Mary is the same one who anoints Jesus' feet with expensive perfume and then dries them with her hair. Remember that? We'll see that in a few weeks in chapter 12. How did she have that expensive perfume? The family could afford it. So this is a family who has access to wealth. And they were Jesus's friends. And so Martha's response, the other aspect of this, when Martha heard, verse 20, that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him. Oh my, that breaks a cultural norm. Because in Shiva, and this is true for observant Jews today, when the people came to sit with you, that's what you were supposed to say sitting. And the fact that Martha got up when she had guests in her house and went to, that tells you a couple things. One was she was willing to potentially incur the criticism of those who had traveled 2 miles to comfort the family. She just got up and walked out of the house. You did not do that. That's like slamming your guests, right? So what that tells you is that she thought enough that Jesus overrode this cultural norm for her to get up and leave. That's just not done in Jewish culture, right? So she goes to meet him, and now it turns into this discussion, and it's on the level of the mind. And she says in verse 21, 22, she's not rebuking. It kind of maybe sounds like she's rebuking. If you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. No, that's really not a rebuke. It's a dual expression. On one hand, she's expressing her grief and her sorrow. She's saying, my brother died. If you had been here, it wouldn't have happened. So there is an expression of her own sorrow and grief. But then it's also an expression of her confidence. Verse 22, but even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Why? Because there is something in Martha's mind that understands that Jesus has access to God the Father. Whatever you ask of God, you're going to get it. And Martha also knows in her mind that she has access to Jesus. That's why she got up out of the house, broke the cultural norm, and went to see him. She has access. That's why they sent the message to him 90 miles away. They had access to him. Now, let's build this a little bit stronger here. Verse 23, 24. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day. We brought this up last week, and I want to revisit this. And this is going to be a theme through the rest of our time this morning. This understanding of death, that on one hand, there's a cosmological understanding of death, and then there's a historical understanding of death. Cosmologically, we said, that basically is John 3:16. God so loved the world, and literally world in John 3:16 is the Greek word cosmos. So a cosmological understanding of death is basically, why does death happen? And we'll see the answer to that in a little bit. The historical understanding of death is, what happened? What happened? A specific person died, in this case, Lazarus. And so you are constantly in this, at times, a tension and trying to say, well, on the one hand, cosmologically, and this is what Martha slips into this. She's saying, I know long term, I know that on the final day there will be a resurrection. Now, Martha was in agreement with the majority of Jewish people, because the majority of the Jews in the first century, including the Pharisees, believed in the resurrection. The Sadducee party, the other half of the Sanhedrin, did not believe in a resurrection. So Martha is on the side of the Pharisees and the majority of the Jewish population, and she is thinking in terms of cosmologically. She's saying to Jesus, okay, I know that sometime in the future, on the last day, my brother will rise again. What Jesus is trying to do is set her free from that limited understanding and move her to what he's about to do, because what he's about to do with her brother is on the historical side. He's going to take a specific person that died. And so she's saying, I know sometime in the future, my brother will rise again. And then Jesus, verse 25, says to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. That's a little bit similar to what he's already said earlier in the gospel. Remember when he fed people that were hungry, the 5,000? He gave them bread, right? He is the provider of bread to the hungry. And in the same way, he said, but I'm not only the provider of bread, but I am the bread. He also said, I provide light to everybody, but I'm also the light of the world. So you're constantly back and forth on this. And he says, it's personal, Martha. I am the resurrection. I am the resurrection. And people are going to die. So he's not dismissing the historic. Your brother really died. People are going to die, but they're going to live. And that's not a contradiction, because I'm involved. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. And then this powerful question: do you believe this? And quite honestly, friends, when you come to Trinity Baptist on Sunday morning, or another church, or maybe you're just out in town and you're talking to someone who's a follower of Jesus, when you hear the gospel explained, that's always the question, isn't it? Do you believe? And belief is not just intellectual, but the Bible, biblically, do you believe this? What Jesus is saying there is, do you put your trust in me? Because if you believe this, that means you not just believe intellectually and mentally, but you have moved beyond your mind to your will. And your will says, I will make a decision to put my trust in you based on what my mind tells me. There's evidence. I don't have to put my brain on the shelf to be a follower of Jesus. He's very patient to explain it to me. It makes sense. There's a reason. That's a reasonable faith. And this is one of the great confessions in the whole Bible. Now, why is this important? Martha, the discussion is kind of at the level of her mind, isn't it? But this also reminds us, we talked a little bit about this last week. When Thomas was the one when Jesus said, we need to go back to Judea, and his disciples say, no, look, they were just trying to kill you there. Why do you want to go back there? And he said, Lazarus is dead, and it's our friend Lazarus. And then Thomas, and you would have expected Peter to say this because it fits the personality. Thomas, who gets typecast in the Bible as the doubting Thomas, right? And yet he's the first one to say, well, then let's go. Let's all go and die together. And so what you see earlier in chapter 11 is that Thomas has a capacity not to be stereotyped. There's more to Thomas than just his doubts. Well, that's the same thing with Martha. People typecast Martha, and they said, oh, well, she's the busybody, she's the task-oriented, she's in the kitchen, she's the critic over younger sister. Martha's this, and this. Well, okay, but she's also this. She has a mind, and she uses her mind. And she says, one of the great confessions in the whole Bible, I believe what? That you're the Christ, that you're the Son of God, you're the one coming into the world. So there's more to Martha than just being task-oriented. Just like there's more to you than people have tagged you with. Probably, if you sit back, I'm sure you've had this at times. There are times probably, maybe in your family or your circle of friends, where people say, well, there's, I don't want to use your name, but there's so-and-so. Well, and maybe you've heard that so long now as an adult. Maybe you've been told your whole life that you're this, this, and this, that now you believe it. But every now and then you probably surprise yourself, and maybe you surprise your family by saying something and doing something that's almost the opposite of what everybody stereotypes you with, right? We've all had those moments. And that's what's going on here. So Christ in our mind. How about Christ in our emotion? Because there's another sister. Verse 28, when she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." When she heard it, she rose quickly, went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was, saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit, greatly troubled, and he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." And then Jesus wept. Christ in our emotion. Martha goes to find her sister, not to criticize her, but to draw her away from this cultural, ceremonial, ritual mourning that was going on, because she knew that even though this was the normal thing that Jews did during Shiva, that somebody was here that was going to break that pattern. And just like her sister Mary needed to see Jesus and talk to him. And so she loves her sister enough to pull her away. The crowd thinks she's going to the tomb. So she still can't get away, right? Everybody goes out with her, you know. And but you know, actually that's not a bad thing, because they're at the tomb. They're going to become witnesses to what happens to Lazarus, right? So in one sense, it's probably not a bad thing. But you can't get away from the crowd, right? But notice verse 32. And friends, I have seen this so many times. I was thinking, I counted up recently. I think I've conducted about 175 funerals now in the last 40 years. And I've seen this time after time after time. You're with a family, they're burying a loved one, and the stereotypes come up. You know, and sometimes people will say this on their own behalf. Sometimes family members will say, "Well, you need to watch out for so-and-so at the funeral on Friday because they're going to break down. You know, they're going to fall apart." On the other hand, you know, Uncle Smitty, hey man, he'll get up and he'll say the right, you know, and then you find out that you get surprised, right? The day of death brings things up in a family and in personalities that sometimes are predictable and sometimes they're not. People rise to the occasion, they fall because of the occasion. You see it all. I am not surprised by anything anymore at a funeral. And one of the things you see through the years, I've seen this year after year after year after year. You'll see two members of a family, and you will be told, and there will be evidence that this person is like this person is like this. They're their brother, their sister, their sisters, their family members, whatnot. And they will even laugh about it. They'll say, "Well, yeah, I'm just the polar opposite to my sister." But on the day of death, you know what happens on the day of death? I've seen this so many times, I just don't even argue it anymore. People that legitimately are opposites, and those of you that are parents, have you noticed that your kids are different? Breathtaking insight, right? Those of you that have brothers and sisters, have you noticed that you're very different that you're not like your brothers and sisters? Yeah. But there's something about death that brings very different people to a point where they say the same thing and they feel the same thing. It's amazing. It's not even amazing to me anymore. It just, frankly, I expect it now. And this is what happens with Martha and Mary. Very different personalities, but they say the same thing. Verse 32, Mary came to where Jesus was, saw him, fell at his feet. What does she say? Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Where have you heard that before? Martha. Two sisters, very different, say the same thing. Now, but here's where you then come back, and this is also God's creation. God loves diversity, right? He wants your children to be different. If all your kids were the same, some of them wouldn't be necessary, right? So now you see their response. Martha worships Jesus with her words, this great confession, yes, I believe. Mary worships Christ by falling at his feet. Her emotion affects her physical stature. She falls, and that's part of her worship. Martha used her mind, Mary uses her emotions, but they're both expressing worship, right? And then verse 33, 34. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. This has been a little bit of a problem for some Bible students through the years, and it's very sad that it ever is a problem, because it just shows you our lack of insight into the human condition. This is a very strong word, and when it says that Jesus was greatly troubled, it means two things. That's a word that means anger to the point of outrage. And so when it says Jesus was deeply moved and greatly troubled, he was outraged. The emotion that Jesus feels at this moment includes outrage. Now you might say to yourself, wait a minute. He's going to weep in it. I thought he was grieving. I thought he was identifying with these people in grief. Well, we'll see that in a minute, because the second thing this word means is compassion. Care, sensitivity. And unfortunately, and sometimes even you read Bibles, commentaries, sometimes even study Bibles. If you read the notes, sometimes even people that write study Bibles, they will go overboard on this, and they'll say, well, this means that Jesus was angry and upset. Well, it does, but then they ignore the fact that it also means that he was deeply moved because of his compassion over people that were grieving and weeping. And then other people emphasize his grief and his compassion, and they ignore his outrage. Both are true. And unfortunately, a lot of times we forget that. And maybe it's just part of our lack of observation of the human condition. But both emotions can exist in the same time in the same person. You can be outraged at the same time that you're just overwhelmed with tender compassion. They are not a contradiction. What's he outraged over? He's outraged over the fact that God did not design his creation and men and women to die. If you want to know why Jesus was part of he was greatly troubled and deeply moved, and it was anger. He was angry over the evidence that showed him, with all these people that were weeping over death, that death was not God's original intent. You have to go all the way back to Genesis. Everything God created was good, right? And he said to Adam and Eve, I'm going to give you a choice. You can follow me or you cannot follow. It's just one thing. I just give you one thing. And Adam and Eve made their choice, and it's affected us ever since. That outrages God. He said, you've taken the beauty of my creation. I created all this good. And in order for it to be good, I had to give you freedom. And so you chose. That's an outrage. Look what you did to my creation. And it not only affects people. If you read Romans, this is why this is so profound. It's not just what happens to human beings, what sin does to human beings. It's affected the whole creation. Read Romans chapter 8. The day is going to come where not only will human beings be restored and to fellowship with God in Christ, through Christ, but it says that the whole creation groans because of sin, because of the choice that goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. So this is where the cosmological understanding of death comes in. It's cosmological because it not only includes people, it includes the universe. You can go to Yosemite National Park and think, oh, this is from the hand of God. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And I get inspired. That's why I go to Yosemite every year for a day and lap it up, or Yellowstone Park or Grand Canyon. But what's really sobering is, if you're a Bible believer, when you drive away from Yellowstone or Yosemite or the Grand Canyon, you have to say to yourself, if I believe the Bible, then this is marred. Yosemite and Yellowstone and Grand Canyon have been affected by sin. Those places don't look like God's originally intended. Now, they look pretty good, they're pretty inspiring, but they're groaning. And this is deep, this goes deep. Look at verse 35 then. Then what is Jesus' response? Jesus wept, shortest verse in the whole Bible, 2 words. But what's so important about this is, it's a different word. The word that is used for Mary weeping, for the Jews that were with her weeping, we translate it's weeping in English. When it says Jesus wept, it's a different word in the Greek language. The word for Mary and those that were with her that was weeping, that's the kind of weeping that eventually just comes out in shrieking, screaming, just massive expression of pain and sorrow, and in the face of death. The word that is translated Jesus wept is more I don't want to say restrained, but it's almost a quiet inside weep. It comes out, and he had tears coming down his cheeks, but it wasn't shrieking and it wasn't screaming. And even the word's different. Why? Why is it different? It's Christ in emotion. It's his own emotion. It's just this overwhelming combination of anger at what people have done to God's original intention, and it's also compassion for how broken up all these people are in the face of Lazarus' death. And so you can't separate the two. He saw what Mary and Martha saw, the physical death of someone they loved. But he also saw what only God saw, that the reason for Lazarus' death is the same for your death and mine. It's cosmological. If sin had not happened, we don't die, right? And that's what Jesus comes to restore. Now, one last little thing on this, and this is really crucial as we kind of move toward the end of this morning. These two emotions that sometimes are contradictory, even Bible scholars get out of on the edge on this. If you only express grief without outrage, you might end up just being a sentimental person. If all you do is just grieve and you weep and you cry over someone that died, and there's no anger inside you because you grieve over what happened, but if you don't have outrage over why it happened, then you just end up as a sentimental person. You just spend the rest of your life. I had a great-grandmother who her husband died, and she wore black her whole life. And I still remember I never met her, but I remember my father's generation. They used to just look at her and say, "Come on, Grandma." your husband died 52 years ago. Why are you still? And she was in the Baptist church every Sunday morning. What went wrong with her Bible study? That she didn't move out of this. It's okay for a little bit. Let's go to the other extreme. If you only have outrage over death, but you don't have grief, then you end up cold, arrogant, judgmental, harsh. They go together. When someone that you love dies, and if you feel emotionally that you have anger and you have compassion, and you just are trying to say, well, how can I have both? Well, you have both because Jesus had them. You were created to have both. Last point here, Christ and culture, and this is really this leads us into next week. We won't spend a lot of time on this. But look at the two reactions. So the Jews said, see how he loved him, verse 36. If you just stop at verse 36, the reaction there is what we just talked about. These are people that say, oh, we see Jesus weeping, so he must just have compassion. It's very sentimental, right? If you just stop there, they said, well, Jesus is just like us. We're weeping, he's weeping. But then verse 37 moves into the other aspect. Some of them said, well, look, he healed a man that was blind back in chapter 9, so why didn't he raise Lazarus? So they become critical. So you see an example here of what we just said. In verse 36, you have people that are kind of trapped in sentimentality. In verse 37, you have people that are trapped in arrogance and harshness, cold, critical, all of that, right? Several years ago, I was over, I had a friend who went to Scotland for graduate school. So I went over to visit them, and one afternoon they were near. I went for a hike along this beautiful river. And in fact, John and Susan were over there a few weeks ago in that same area. And I was walking along this river and noticed a bridge, a very old stone bridge, archway that was over the river. I thought, oh, that's very interesting. When I got a little closer, I saw two women there, older woman, younger woman, and got a little closer. And I was starting to walk up on the bridge. They were standing right at the crest of the bridge overlooking the river. And it was a very cold day. They both had heavy jackets on. And when I moved toward them, I saw the younger woman reach inside her coat, and she pulled out a box, and she went like this, threw it into the river. And then she collapsed and just started screaming with grief and sobbing and just shrieking emotion. And the older woman sat down and just held her, put her arms around her and just held her close. And I thought, oh boy. So I tried to be discreet, just kind of stood in the background and waited about 10 minutes. And they finally, the shrieking stopped and they both got kind of quiet. So I walked over and I said, I don't mean to pry, but can I be of any help? Or can I do anything for you? The older woman looks up at me and she says, we're not doing well. I said, this is my daughter. And I said, oh. And I said, well, ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, that box you threw in the river, were there ashes in that box? And the younger woman looks up at me, just tear-stained. She said, yeah, that was my husband. I said, oh. And then she started telling me, the whole story, and she said how this was a very special place in their life, and her husband, before he died, had cancer. She was young, probably 28 years old. And she said, before my husband, he made me promise that I would, put the ashes in this river that was very special to us. So I told her, I said, could we just have a little acknowledgement of your husband's life? And I said, would you mind if I had a little New Testament. So I said, could I just read something from the Bible? And then could I just say a prayer? And they said, oh, could you do that? We weren't able to have a funeral. And I said, yeah. So we spent, I don't know, a half hour or so. We just said a few words and prayed, and I gave him my card, and I said, look, if I can just be of any service to you, and here's some things maybe to think about. But you know what I was thinking about that day, and then I was thinking about that this week because of this text that we're in. Culturally, there were things that you have to be aware of, and whether you agree with the culture or not. For those two women, that was how they handled death. And but in that moment, even they were able to talk about this husband, the young man that had died, and describe him. So that was kind of what you might call the historical understanding of death. They could tell me about this life that ended so short, 28 years old. What they were willing to hear, only just in a little bit, before I left, I was just able to say a little bit about what we've been calling this morning the cosmological understanding of death. A little bit about how God, that there is a God, and this is what God says about death. But they could not, in that moment, that was not the time to give them a 45-minute lecture on Genesis chapter 3 or John 11. And I would just say this to you, friends, that I don't know what you're going through. If you're not currently in the midst of grief, you probably have been, and you probably will be. And equally important, people right now that either are in the middle of it, have been, and will be. And so part of the question for you is, can you come alongside people based on your own experience as a follower of Jesus and somehow help them to understand that Christ can deal with our mind, even in the midst of death. He certainly can deal with our emotion. And he can deal with the cultural understanding that maybe we've been brought up to, and maybe we need to break out of, just like Martha and Mary had to. So next week, we're really going to have some good news for you. Because next week, we're going to actually deal with the raising of Lazarus, and then our friend Gary Derashinsky will be here October 8 and 15. Even your insert says June 4th. That was a misprint. But so we're going to this is going to be a good few weeks together. So hopefully we'll see you. Let's sing, and then we'll be finished for today.